Welcome everyone to Volunteer Engagement, not just for volunteer coordinators. This is Shannon Day, the Training and Technical Assistance Manager with CCADV. Prior to my position with CCADV, I was the Volunteer and Training Manager, Program Manager at a domestic violence program. And I have to say, this is a topic that I absolutely love to speak about and I'm very passionate about. So I'm excited to have all of you with us today.
My name is Katie Abeda, and I am the Director of Victim Advocacy and Outreach for the Sexual Assault Victim Advocate Center in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I oversee our hotline advocates as well as our staff and interns who work on our 24-hour crisis line and coordinate their response to police stations, hospitals, court, and that sort of thing, along with overseeing our other volunteer programs. And as Shannon said, really excited to be here to talk about working with volunteers, share some of the strategies that have worked really well for us, and maybe learn from you all and have a good conversation about how we do this work well. So,
all right. So as we get started today, we would like to know who's with us. We did have a poll, but due to some of our technical difficulties, we're going to ask if you could just type this into the chat real quick. Let us know if you are a sexual assault or domestic violence advocate. Perhaps if you are a survivor or any other role that you might have in your organization. So if you can type in just real quick in the chat so we know what type of individuals are with us today and what you're doing. We'll give everyone just a minute or so to do that. Wow, it looks, Katie, like we have a nice wide range of individuals with us today, from some executive directors to quite a few advocates. Looks like we also have some survivors and speakers, director of development, some program managers.
And I'm seeing both system-based and community-based, which is always exciting for us as well. So hopefully we'll be able to address everyone's needs today in the time that we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for taking a minute to do that. We appreciate that. And now we just want to say thank you to those who shared their questions regarding today's topic when you registered. Want to let you know too that there will be plenty of time to ask questions throughout and at the end as well. But based on what you asked for, we are excited to share our goals for today. We're going to talk about some onboarding, training, and retention ideas, creative ways to engage volunteers, and then really an important piece is recognizing the fact that everyone can participate in this, and this isn't just something that should fall to a volunteer coordinator or a volunteer manager. But as we get started, really the first thing that we look at doing is how we recruit volunteers. So I'd like to invite you all now to type this into the chat box. What are you currently doing to recruit volunteers? So we have a few people starting to type their answers, and we're starting to see some different things coming in. Facebook and LinkedIn posts, I think that's a great suggestion. Advocate dinners. Kathy assigning volunteer recruitment to an employee and hoping to learn more about how to do it in this webinar. We hope that you do too, Kathy.
I'm seeing a lot of Facebook too, and so I think social media can be a really great tool that lots of people use, and also keeping in mind now with net neutrality and things might be changing a little bit, reach on Facebook is going to be a lot different moving forward. And so how do we strategize with that as well, and how maybe do we work around what might become a potential barrier?
Good. So based on a lot of the things that you guys have shared, a lot of these are different opportunities for recruiting. A bunch of you have said talking about booths or tabling. If you happen to live in a community where there is a college of any size, is certainly a good place to be able to get volunteers. We saw quite a few make notes about newspapers. Keep in mind in newspapers, checking with your newspaper, it's not necessarily paying money to run an ad, but more would they let you do a press release, or is there a volunteer section in your newspaper where you can make sure to always be listing things there. Being involved with United Way, I don't know, as we looked through there, I'm not sure if I really saw anyone listing that, but your United Way in your area, or United Way 211, making sure your organization is listed with them and any volunteer opportunities that you have, and that you keep that up to date as well. So it seems that we all kind of can think of some of those general things when it comes to recruitment and have good ways to do that. But I want you to think about recruitment even in a broader sense, and how a lot of the other things that we do can really lend themselves towards good recruitment. So prompt follow-up is an absolute necessity when it comes to getting volunteers. Especially if you utilize anything like Facebook posts or United Way or newspapers, where people are maybe going to call or email you and express an interest in volunteering. Contacting them right away and letting them know, or learning a little bit more about them and then letting them know how they could get involved with you. When I was in my role as a volunteer manager, I can't tell you how many times people said they had reached out to quite a few different organizations, and I was the first one and sometimes only one that followed up with them. So make sure you're following up.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important with that too is, I know in my organization at SAVA, we host trainings only about 2 or 3 times a year for our volunteer hotline advocates. And sometimes I'm following up with people immediately, but I'm also communicating right away and telling them, hey, our next hotline training isn't going to be until the summer. And now, we're quite a few months out from that. But here's what you can do to get involved in the meantime, so that we're still keeping people engaged and that we're not losing them due to the wait time that they're having to, hold out for that volunteer training.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Katie. I also invite you to think about your position descriptions, and not to put anyone on the spot here, but I'll share from my experience. We had crisis line volunteers, we had front desk volunteers, we had food bank volunteers. And if you think about that in a position description, they all already know they're volunteers and we know they're volunteers, so do we really need to use that term in the description? Make the job sound kind of exciting or interesting. The program that I came from, we had a front desk position that initially was the front desk volunteer, and I changed that to front desk ambassador. I have to say, to this day, that's still one of my favorite things, because I think being an ambassador for something sounds very cool and would be a position I'd want to get involved in. So think about your position descriptions and what you're saying there. Making sure, too, that you're looking for a variety of volunteers and finding ways. Again, if you are in a college town, chances are you kind of have volunteers that are coming to you from that, or maybe in an area where there just seems to be a certain group of people that tend to always volunteer. But how can you branch out from that? Thinking about different genders, thinking about different work experience, different ages of people getting involved. And I know too, even reaching out more specifically when I said different genders, but getting men involved, and then even those from underrepresented populations and involving them. And I know, Katie, you guys have had a good experience with that.
Yeah, and so our bilingual victim services coordinator, Stephanie at SAVA, has made a really concentrated effort to try and recruit members in the Latinx community to become more involved with SAVA's volunteer positions. And so we started off, we only had a couple of Spanish-speaking volunteers who volunteered on the hotline. And Stephanie made a real effort to go and speak. We're lucky in Fort Collins to have a large university and a large community college, but she went into, Spanish major classrooms and to different clubs on campus, and really, she papered around areas where Latinx community might be more highly concentrated, and really made an effort. And now she has a whole volunteer program that she's actually kind of running on her own of individuals who are bicultural and bilingual, who are helping her with some of her events, and that's just grown tremendously.
Thank you for sharing that. A couple other things to think about when we think about recruitment is that initial contact. So again, we said making sure we're following up promptly, but then just making sure that our onboarding process is done really well. This makes for a great recruitment tool, because getting volunteers that are truly a fit for the organization and roles that you need them in is vital. And Katie's going to, and it works really well for the organization, but it also works really well for the volunteers too. So Katie's going to share a little bit more on that just a little bit. We invite you to get staff involved in recruitment. And I know some may be thinking, oh, staff already do a lot, or like, how could we ask them to do more? And this is all true, but just making sure that staff is familiar with volunteer roles that you have. How do they talk about volunteering? So maybe even having in one of your staff meetings discussion around things that staff could do supporting volunteer recruitment and getting volunteers involved, and making sure that they know the process for them getting involved. Just like most of us who work in volunteer management, we have to be familiar with the roles that other staff do, because that's where we're going to be finding volunteers to support those staff roles. We're basically asking staff to do the same thing, is be familiar sort of with our role as a volunteer manager or coordinator, and how it is we onboard volunteers so that they could speak about it in a way that's beneficial for the organization. And last but not least, and certainly as we continue in this presentation, we're going to talk about this more, but happy volunteers. The happier and more engaged your volunteers are, the chances are for them to refer other volunteers. And this is where I would say, again, the importance of making sure you follow up promptly when they refer someone. If someone calls and says, hey, Susie told me to give you a call, she's loving volunteering there, making sure you touch base. Don't make the assumption that this volunteer wants to do the exact same thing that Susie does or have those same needs, but take the time to find out what it is that they're looking for. And at the same time, if a volunteer keeps saying, well, I've told so-and-so and I've told so-and-so, haven't they reached out to you? Maybe saying, well, could we call them together right now? And just making that phone call with them, or seeing if they would give you some information to be able to do that. So those are some suggestions that we have around recruitment.
So moving on a little bit here, I want to talk about something that's really vitally important, and that's communication. Give everyone a second to take a look at what I've got on the screen here. I'm a dog person, I'm a pet person. As you'll see, we kind of infuse that into what we've got going on here today. But I use this as a demonstration, one, because it's fun, and two, because I like to talk about communication. And so here we have a crisis. Something has happened and everyone's panicking and things aren't going very well. And so I want to talk about maybe what that might look like and how that might come up as we're onboarding or recruiting volunteers. So one thing that I think is super important is to talk about communication. And the first piece of that communication, kind of the first thing that Shannon's talked about, is going to be that initial contact, whether that's in person at a tabling event, or over the phone, or perhaps you're emailing someone. I think that's the majority of how I get connected with volunteers. But from the very beginning, you're having that open communication. And then what your next step is likely going to look like is probably an application and interview process. And one thing that I really feel very strongly about is making sure that you're asking the hard questions in the application and the interview process. And what I mean by the hard questions is, are you asking about that individual's own experience and potential victimization that they're bringing forward? We know that many people who've gone through interpersonal violence feel very motivated to come out and try and support others who've gone through the same thing. That can be a great part of their healing process. It can also be really fulfilling for that individual and really helpful for your organization. So are you asking about that up front? And the reason for that being is that it's incredibly important for you as the person who's overseeing or working with volunteers to know the background that someone's coming in with to the organization, and to be able to assess if this person is in an appropriate place in their healing process to be able to provide support. And the way that I describe that to people, those questions are in our application people have to fill out. We're asking if they've been a survivor of sexual violence. We're asking some really tough and sensitive questions around topics that intersect with what we're doing. So abortion, immigration, these kind of things come up on our application. So right from the front there, we're communicating our values, and we're also letting the person know, hey, this is what you're going to be talking about here. Do our values match the values you're bringing and hopefully bringing to the organization? So, and then we're following up with that. So in the application, they're being asked that, and then I'm also asking that in the interview. I'm asking them to talk about, not necessarily in detail, but talk about, have you been a victim of sexual violence, or have you experienced familial violence or domestic violence? And can you talk to me about where you are in your healing process? And I always preface that for people saying, I'm not trying to get in your business. I'm not trying to make you talk about something that's obviously really uncomfortable. And it's also important for us to have that open door communication. So I know if you're volunteering and you happen to take a call or to do a walk-in or go to the hospital with someone whose experience really closely mirrors your own, I'm probably going to be reaching out to you and I'm going to be asking, how are you doing? I want to check in with you. Should we go get coffee and sit down and talk about what this has been like for you in this experience? And I always tell people that volunteering should be something that enhances your life and moves you forward and continues you on that healing journey. It should never be something that's setting you back in your own healing. And so that's a really important conversation that we have. And in that, I think it's also really important to identify people who may not be at an appropriate place in their healing process to be able to assist somebody and to be able to truly be there without causing harm to themselves or potentially, inadvertently causing harm to the people that we serve. So one question that I want to pose that you can think about and we'll address in a little bit here is it okay to say no to someone who is wanting to be a volunteer, especially if that person's a survivor? And I know that coming from different agencies, there are different pressures. And so if you're in a really small rural agency where you really depend on volunteers, it might be a lot harder to have that conversation because you may very much need the support. And so we're going to talk about that here in a minute. I also want to talk about timeline policies. So I know I've worked in some agencies where there is a set timeline that someone has had to be removed from their, abusive situation. So, is it a year? Is it 3 years? What does that look like? And one question I invite you to talk about in your organizations is, if you do have that timeline policy, I want you all to ask yourselves, is the timeline policy necessary and is it effective? So I know that there have been times when, I will share with you that at Salva, we don't have a timeline policy. There is no set amount of time that someone has had to have been removed from that situation to be able to volunteer with us. And when I first started in this position, that made me a little nervous because I think sometimes that can be a nice thing to lean on when you've got someone in your office who, maybe very clearly is not an appropriate fit or has not done enough self-work to be able to volunteer. It's really nice to be able to say, oh, well, you know what, it hasn't been a year. And so, come back after it's been another 6 months. That's kind of a nice fallback to be able to have. But I want to share with you an example that happened to me over the last year that I think really clearly illustrates and helps clarify for me why this is so important to not have this timeline policy. So I was interviewing for interns to work in our Fort Collins office, and I had 2 individuals back-to-back coming in for an internship. And both of them disclosed that they had been survivors of sexual violence. The first person who came to me, her victimization had actually happened within the last year. So it hadn't even been a full year since she'd experienced sexual assault. And I was asking her kind of, where are you in the healing process? She said, you know what? I had really great friends. I got support immediately. I started therapy. Everyone believed me. Everyone supported me. And I'm really good now. And things are great. And I feel like I can do this. So the next person I had was someone who had experienced childhood victimization. So we're talking, 17, 18 years ago. And she shared with me that I was the first person she'd ever told. Was in this interview, on that application, having this conversation. I was the only one she'd ever spoken to about it. And so that was a really clear illustration to me that although the second individual might have fit outside of that timeline policy that we're talking about, had we had that, it's very, very clear to me that she's probably not in a position to be able to, and just kind of in our conversation as she was sharing, it became very clear that this would likely be something that would set her back in her healing process. And so we had an open conversation about that, and we're very clear. And that is one that does 2 purposes. One, that helps set you up for success, because what's more difficult when we're talking about going back to the other side when you're in that crisis mode is if you feel obligated to keep someone, or you stick to that timeline policy and say, well, it's been more than a year, and so I have nothing to stand on to say no to this person. And you get this person involved in volunteering, then you're probably setting yourself up for a situation in the future where there's going to be an incident, or there's going to be something that this person gets really triggered, or they're not able to provide services effectively, and then it's much, much, much more difficult to then have a parting conversation when that person's already a volunteer, right? Where if you can set that standard up front and say, hey, I think it's great you want to be involved. Here are the things that I'm seeing just in our interview that I want to take note of and have a conversation about. And then we'll talk a little bit about kind of moving on, training requirements and training format here. So I kind of asked the question, is it okay to say no to someone who wants to volunteer? And I feel like I've kind of prefaced that. But just kind of thinking about your organization, and I really encourage you to be able to say no to people who want to be a volunteer. And Shannon, I don't know if you want to share your experience in this point. I think Shannon has a really great story to share with you about why this might be really beneficial for people.
So one of the things when I first went into my role as the volunteer manager, I, learning it, went and visited with staff and asked them about how it was working with volunteers, things that they liked, things that they didn't like, because I was in a brand new position and really had about 3 days of training with the person who was leaving. So I was learning it basically from scratch. And one of the things that I learned from staff was sometimes how difficult it was working with volunteers that just really weren't a good fit, but they felt like they were put into a position where if someone wanted to volunteer, they just basically had to say yes and accept them. And so I really felt like that wasn't working out well for staff and didn't necessarily want to be that way. So we had conversation around everything that Katie has just been talking about, of being very clear about expectations from the beginning. A few of you even made comments when registering for this that you do a lot with recruiting, but then when it comes to the onboarding time or retaining them, that's where you'll start to have people drop off. And one of the things that I realized pretty early on was, even if I went somewhere and I had a booth and I had 30 people fill out that they were interested in volunteering, if I even had 10 people that then I reached out to and I had 10 respond and say, yes, I'm interested, and if out of those 10, I could have 3 to 5 that were a fit, to me, that was success. Because having all those others that maybe weren't going to be a fit really was going to prove to be somewhat frustrating for them. It would be frustrating for staff. And in the end, for all of us, it doesn't serve the survivors that we're working with. So keeping that in mind, of it's okay to have some good standards and guidelines when you're first starting. And we really don't have time for it today, but one time, if you ever catch me someplace else, feel free to visit with me about the first time I interviewed to be a volunteer at a program and was told very politely, thanks, but no thanks, and they sent me on my way to read some books. So knowing that that's where I came from, when starting out, definitely also gives me kind of a different viewpoint to this. But it's okay to set some high standards and remember that they're good for you, they're good for the program, they're good for other staff members, and in the end, it's really what's best for survivors and those we're working with.
And I'm going to acknowledge that that can be an awkward and uncomfortable conversation, and also knowing that we have awkward and uncomfortable conversations all day long. That's kind of the field that we're in. But again, keeping in mind, when I sit down and I meet with someone and I accept them for a volunteer position, it's also an ongoing relationship. And so I tell them, this is something that we'll be checking in together about, and midway through training, we're going to talk and say, hey, how are you feeling? Is this still feeling like something you want to do? Is this feeling like a good fit for you? And if they're bringing things to me and saying maybe it's not, then it's okay for us to part ways, and there's no hard feelings about that. And the same for me, that I might approach you and say, hey, here are some of the things I'm seeing. Can we, readjust, and can we both get on the same page? Or is this where our relationship needs to end in this capacity? Are there other opportunities that maybe aren't direct service that this person can get involved in? Maybe they're finding, actually, this is not quite what I was thinking or what I was signing up for. I'd rather just come and help with special events and maybe not have that direct client contact. And that's perfect. That's exactly what you want. You want to make sure it's, of course, a good fit for them, but it also needs to be a good fit for you, because if not, it's going to become a much more difficult issue. And if you think it's difficult to fire employees, it's super difficult to fire volunteers. And so hopefully you can kind of eliminate some of those from the beginning. And we also just want to talk about what are the minimum hours that are training requirements for domestic violence, sexual assault. And so we know for domestic violence, it's 15 hours, sexual assault, it's 30 hours. And I would venture to say that probably the majority of people are doing something much more like 40. I know that's our requirement at SAVA, that it's a 40-hour at least in classroom, and then we probably do an additional, I would say, 3 to 4 hours of outside role playing and practicing with other volunteers, and then coming back to do final evaluations. So really it ends up looking probably more like 45. And I would venture to guess that that's probably what other agencies are doing as well.
And keeping in mind too, we recognize the fact that Colorado is a very rural state. We know that many of you might be working in smaller communities where, when Katie talks about the fact that at SAVA they offer training 2 to 3 times a year, but she can probably have anywhere from 10 to 15 people attending those trainings. For those of us who are working in smaller rural communities, we might not have that if we only offered something 2 to 3 times a year, but only had a couple of people. So what your training looks like in those rural communities might look a little bit different. Perhaps for those who are members of CCADV, utilizing the Online Learning Center and some of those courses there. And of course, not relying on online learning, but then having a follow-up conversation with someone around that, even providing some videos for individuals to watch or some reading material, and then having a way to check in with them with that too. Katie did mention because of SAVA and the way they're set up, they're able to do their 40 hours as a classroom style. The program that I came from, we did about 20 hours in a classroom style, and then we added the additional hours more through specialized training for specific roles, and then actually doing more shadowing, them shadowing staff, and then staff shadowing them. So we still eventually did probably get to that 40 hours, but we looked at some different and creative ways to do that. So we'd invite all of you to think about that too. For those who are members of CICASA, they have a lot of great materials on their website, and I know can provide a lot of support around training for volunteers. And certainly those who are members of CCADV, like I said, you have the Online Learning Center, and we too can provide some more resources, or even just sit and visit with you and brainstorm some ways maybe that you can look at training and what that might look like. So before we move on, we do want to ask, and if you guys just want to type it into the chat box, is there any specific questions around onboarding? Any of these pieces that we've covered here could be questions or maybe challenges that you have faced when working in this area. We'll give everyone just a minute maybe to type in anything in the chat box if you've got some specific questions or challenges in this area and working with volunteers. Well, either you all are doing an amazing job and we can invite some of you to participate in the future on this webinar, or Katie, we covered things quite well.
Lots of things.
So now let's talk a little bit about volunteer engagement. So here we have a little kitty who certainly is slightly engaged in what's going on. And this is where we like to invite you again to think about broadening your scope of the way you think about utilizing volunteers. So one of the things that I initially would run into when I first started in my role at the agency I worked at was, I would say, there'd be a task, and sometimes it would be, kind of busy work, quote unquote busy work. And they would say, oh, volunteers aren't gonna wanna do that. They're not gonna wanna do that. So the first thing I can say to you is, don't make assumptions about what volunteers will or won't do. Obviously, depending on your organization and the guidelines that are there, and we know that confidentiality certainly is something we have to keep in mind, and them making sure they've received the training to be working directly with survivors. So paying attention to those and staying within those guidelines, but get creative about ways that you're utilizing volunteers, and ask. Because the one thing to remember, and this is true for us in life in general, is if we don't ask the question, the answer is always no, right? So if we ask, we at least give them an opportunity to say yes or say no, or say, well, that wouldn't work, but this might work. So making sure that we're reaching out to volunteers with some of those things. And if we are asking volunteers from time to time to do some busy work, and again, keep in mind, some roles, that may be what it is. had a volunteer come in once a week or every other week and did data entry for me, because volunteers would come in and have to sign in on the sign-in sheet for the volunteer hours that they spent. And then I took that and had to put that in a spreadsheet so that then I could get the stats, which we are all very familiar with and know needs to happen. So I had a volunteer who was like, yeah, I have no problem doing that. It was not something I necessarily enjoyed doing, so it was great to have someone who didn't mind doing it. But had I not asked, then my supervisor would have really had to be on me about getting those stats. So it was great to have a volunteer do that. And then making sure that the volunteers understand just why what we're asking them to do is important. So it wasn't just me saying, hey, could you type this into a spreadsheet? Because it makes my life easier, which it did. So, I mean, I was honest about that, but explaining, well, this is what the information gets used for, and it gets used for this because of this, which enables us to do this. So make sure you connect the dots for volunteers, and even a task that can seem super small, let them know why that task is so important. Get creative about how you utilize volunteers. We were working on a project in the program, doing like a kind of like an open house, meet and greet, reconnection with individuals who had supported the organization. And it had maybe been a while since we'd seen them. So they had done like a direct mailing and then I think an email invitation. And we really didn't have a lot of RSVPs or people saying that they were going to come. So I suggested we have volunteers call and give personal invitations. Initially, some staff had kind of a little bit of pushback, like, oh, they're not going to want to do that. And I said, so let me ask. So I sent an email to volunteers and said, we have this event coming up. I'd like to know if you could take 10 to 15 minutes of your time and make 10 to 15 phone calls to individuals who've supported the organization in the past. We'd like them to have a personal invitation. Here's the script. Please let me know if you're interested. We had a tremendous amount of volunteers who said yes, they would do that. And our numbers of people who RSVP'd in the time that people started making those personal calls and giving those personal invitations grew about 40%. Immediately, that's how much RSVPs went up, and we had great attendance at the event. Another thing that we did one time that was kind of fun, when we talk about having staff involved in engagement, yearly we did our big gala event and had tons of volunteers who had to help to make that event a success and work it leading up to it as well as at the event itself, and then some follow-up. So then I sent an email to staff and said, you know, we had all these volunteers who helped. I'd love to know if any of you would be interested in calling the volunteers and giving them a personal thank you. And I said, here's kind of a little script of what you could say. You can choose to call 3 to 5 volunteers. It's up to you. And was completely voluntary for staff to get involved with, but a lot of staff did it. And staff really enjoyed that because it gave them a minute to chat with the volunteers who did answer the phone. And the feedback that came from volunteers was awesome. They loved getting that personal thank you. So again, both totally optional things, but because you had individuals that were engaged on both sides and given this opportunity to do this, when asked, they said yes and chose to get involved. Another thing that's really important when it comes to engagement is providing leadership opportunities for volunteers, especially those who want it. Not everyone who volunteers is going to look for this or want this, and some might even know that it's something they want to be involved in, but finding some leadership opportunities. So maybe involving them in training. Earlier, we talked a little bit about training, and we did have someone who asked us a question about sharing our interview and application information. Oh, and I was going to say kind of I thought this went to training as well, but yes, we will share that information, but back to this when it comes to training, this can be a great way to get volunteers involved. When I was a volunteer with the organization, I would have the advocate who was handling the training asked me, hey, Shannon, would you come in and talk to the volunteers about your experience? I love that as a volunteer to just come in and say, here's what I do and why I do it. So I did model that behavior then when I was in that role with training, and I would invite volunteers to come in, ask them for 2 to 3 minutes to share their experience, and then allow those that were in training to hear from them. Or ask them questions about different things. So that was a great way to get volunteers involved. The other thing that I did was started to look for ways to involve volunteers actually in training. So either being involved in the training itself, where we were kind of in that classroom style, again, mostly just coming and sharing their experience, but then for different positions. We had a volunteer who was pretty quiet, likes to work on her own, and I had someone else who needed to be trained in that position. So I said, I felt like the two of them would get along and hit it off. So I just asked her, would you be willing to train this individual? They ended up being like great friends, and to this day still volunteer together at that program. So it put one in a leadership role that she never really asked for or even thought that she wanted, but definitely got her involved and very committed to it. So those are some things to do around engagement.
And then talking about retention, kind of moving into that space. So one thing I think talking about from the very beginning and trying to assess, again, maybe that's even in your interview process, or maybe you're kind of just getting a feel of that as you get to know the person. What kind of experience are they looking for? You know, there are, I think, a few different types of volunteers that I see coming into to want to work. And one of them is someone who kind of just wants to like get in and get out. So there's somebody who you know, really wants to volunteer, maybe feels passionate about the issue, but maybe doesn't have a lot of spare time to be, you know, connecting, and is not going to be someone who's able to do all of your events, but really, really is motivated. So that's somebody who, you know, is probably going to be a great volunteer, but also, you know, may not be the first person to want to jump into anything social that's going on with your group. You also have people who are looking to build a community. So a lot of people who come in to do this work are incredibly passionate and might be the only person in their friend group or their family who really, really cares about ending interpersonal violence or working to combat it. And so some people come in just like, I just really want to connect with others who are like-minded and to build a community so I have support in, you know, what I'm dealing with and trying to be somebody who's an advocate for these type of issues. And so that's a volunteer who, you know, is probably really likely going to want to get to know the other volunteers. They're probably going to want to try and build relationships, not only with other volunteers, but with staff as well, and get involved. And they might be someone who is going to want to do a lot more of maybe your outreach events, going to booths for you, being out in the community, kind of talking about these type of things. Who's going to want to come to your volunteer appreciation party, which if you don't have one, I really encourage you to think about doing them, and then we can talk about ways you can do that for free, because that's always the biggest piece. And then you also have people coming in who may want to be working for your organization. And I know when we have a position open, we're looking to our interns and volunteers and saying, hey, do we have someone who's already trained, who we already have a connection with? And so if you know that about somebody, reaching out to that person specifically when there are things, and that's kind of a little audition for your organization, right? So the next time you have a job opening, you can say, hey, I know this person and they would be a really great fit for this, and I'm going to encourage them to apply. So just thinking about, again, from the beginning, what type of experience are they looking for, and trying to make sure that the position they're getting involved with and the things that you're advertising to them match what type of experience you're looking for. And I think each of those has a role within the organization. And we have a, you know, I think at Sava we have over 40 volunteers, and I have some people from each walk of life, and I think at certain times they might be really, you know, just kind of wanting to come in for get in, get out experience, but then that might grow over time and that might change and adapt. And so it's important to check in with people and see where they are now versus where they were maybe when they first started.
I think that's a really good point, Katie, and I'm glad that you brought that out of having conversations and realizing that someone coming in, their life's going to change also. So perhaps you have a mom who has maybe young ones at home and can only do a little bit right now. Maybe then the kids go to school and now she can do more. It's a very general example, but gives you an idea. Perhaps you have someone who's in school full time and now their schedule's changed and they're done with school, but now they're working full time. So now they have to do something a little bit less. So definitely keeping that conversation open and realizing that what someone starts with doesn't necessarily mean it's going to stay the same, and looking for those opportunities to expand things is important.
So just really quickly, I want to take a second because I think one thing that's really important, I just briefly touched on, is how do we show volunteers our appreciation, and how do we do it in a way if we don't have a budget or if we have a really, really small budget. So I wanted to take a second and have everyone type in the message box there in the little chat. Can you talk about a time when you felt really appreciated and what that looked like for you? So maybe just take a couple seconds here and share that, and we'll see if we have some common threads that come up.
So this is in a personal life, right, Katie?
Yeah,
maybe
personal or professional.
Work.
Yep, either way. So a time when you felt really appreciated for something.
Give everyone a couple seconds to type that into the chat box. How do people show you appreciation? Or maybe how would you like them to show you appreciation if it's not happening enough?
Flower, okay, I'm seeing flowers, thank you cards. I'm seeing communication, so that's a great one. Any others that anyone wants to share? Okay, so I'm seeing acknowledgement being super important, phone calls, survivors caucus, okay. So I'm seeing another, like, people showing appreciation through others. So someone volunteered in high school, the volunteer manager ran into mom and said how much they loved as a volunteer and that the impression they made on the clients. Awesome. So what I want to talk about with appreciation and talking about that is appreciation doesn't have to necessarily be something that's tangible. There are a lot of things you can do that are free. I think Shannon already mentioned some of them. Having staff call and reach out to volunteers is something that I had never thought of until she shared that, but what a great idea, right? It doesn't cost anything. It only takes a couple of minutes. You can enlist other staff to do that. And just showing your appreciation verbally and taking that step to do things for people is really wonderful. At Sava, we do an annual volunteer appreciation party. We have an agreement, or Odell's, which is a big brewery that we have up here, will host a free night where we can go in and for an hour, there's free beer. And then we do a potluck so people can bring food. So there's free food, we bring games, we have prizes, we have giveaways, and those are all things that work done on donation basis. And so that party doesn't cost us any money whatsoever. And we have really great attendance for that as well. So another thing you can think about doing is keeping track of volunteers' birthdays or of their anniversaries volunteering with your program. And so keeping, a stack of, cards that you get from the dollar store, you can get quite a few of them, and sending out a thank you to them, or sending out a birthday card, or sending out, hey, it's your 1-year volunteer anniversary. Congratulations. This is such a wonderful partnership we've entered into. And so just taking those extra steps. And then I think even person to person, moment to moment, I have volunteers who I just reach out and they take a shift last minute and they say, thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. It took a lot of the pressure off of us. That was wonderful. We do, every month we have a volunteer of the month who's featured on our website and social media. And in that, there's a picture of them and we ask them some questions about themselves. Why do you volunteer? What type of things do you like? And that way, it's a really nice way for us to recognize when someone's gone above and beyond and really been very helpful and supportive to Sava, because we could not run and function. We absolutely couldn't make things work without the volunteer support that we do have. So
good. And Katie, what do you think one of the most important things about showing appreciation to volunteers is?
I think the most important thing is knowing that you don't have to do it alone. That it is up to, although you may be in charge of working with volunteers, the entire organization is responsible for making sure volunteers are taken care of. And in the same way that they're helping take care of the organization, we're helping take care of them. And so that's super, super important. And that's a conversation I tell people from the very beginning. As much as you're here to support us, our job is to support you. And let's face it, this is really difficult. And we're lucky as staff when we have a difficult client to be able to process that. At least for our volunteers, a lot of times they're taking those calls when they're at home and they're not interacting with us person to person all the time. And so making sure you have that extra effort to really let them know it's not just you they can go to on staff. Any staff members available, if they want to come in and talk to somebody because they talked to someone and it was really difficult, or they had a really awful experience with a survivor, or something really terrible happened, they can come to anybody on the staff and talk with them and get support.
Then I also think it's really important too to recognize and think about the language that we use. When I initially started in my role as the volunteer manager, people would say to me, well, Shannon, you're volunteer, or you're volunteer this. And from the very beginning, I said, they're not my volunteers, they're our volunteers. So really emphasizing the fact that they're volunteers who are volunteering for the organization. And even making sure that you make a note to volunteers from the very beginning when they come in and they interview with you. Obviously through the onboarding process, they're going to tend to have more interaction with that volunteer manager or coordinator, whoever it is that's filling that role. And so making sure that you from the very beginning have them committed to the movement, to this movement of ending interpersonal violence, and to the organization, your organization that's working to help accomplish this, and that is busy serving survivors and working in this way. So super important thing when thinking about the language that we use. Another really big thing for me is when a volunteer would say something, and they would say, well, I'm just a volunteer. And I would always, pretty much didn't matter where I was or where we were in the conversation, but I would stop them and say, whoa, you are never just a volunteer. And again, to whatever task it is they might have been referring to, or whatever role it is that they're doing, or any way that they're showing support, drawing attention to that, and just, again, the importance of what it is that they're doing, and the fact that we couldn't be here doing this work if it wasn't for them. So always recognizing that, how important the language that we use is, and then making sure that that commitment is to this movement of ending interpersonal violence in the organization you're volunteering with. Because if you, as the volunteer coordinator or manager, move to a different organization or change roles in your organization, if people feel really just a connection with you and they don't have any connection with other staff, it may make it difficult for them to stay. So the more we can involve staff and other volunteers in this process, the better.
And I want to just go back and kind of just piggyback off of what Shan was saying, in that one thing I always do when I start my training groups is I tell people to look around the room and to get to know one another as they go through training, because I always say, like, these are your people. These are the people, we're all in the same room because we care deeply and passionately about this issue. And if everyone else in the world cared, we might not have jobs, right? So things might look a little bit different. But I tell them, these are the people that you want to lean on. These are the people who you want to call and text when there's something that happens in the news, or something comes up that is really difficult for you. Of course, staff are here, but you're here for each other as well, because you may go home and share this information with your partner or your roommates, or whoever you might live with or be connected to, and they might be interested, but they may not take that to heart as much as you are, because you're choosing to step into this role. And so looking around the room and connecting and making those relationships with the other people that are going through this process with you, because this is a community that we're building. And so you have a whole network of people who, hey, when you're outraged and you want to, go to a women's march and you want people to go with you, why don't you call your volunteer friends? Why don't you all go together? Because it's more likely that they're going to want to go do something like that with you.
Thank you, Katie. So one of the other things that individuals requested was some additional resources. And so we just wanted to share, again, obviously CCADV and CCASA are both resources for all of you, as well as Katie and myself. We do have listed here too the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and these resources will be emailed to you also, so you'll have the direct link. But under their resources, then they have volunteer management. Energize Inc. Is specifically for volunteers, and they do offer some free content, and then I think they also offer some that you do need to pay for. It is pretty reasonable, but that could be something to consider when working on your budgets. And then Points of Light is a huge organization that offers a lot of resources for volunteers as well. And sometimes, again, you can find some free content there. And then another one, and I apologize, I forgot to list it here, but is DOVIA, and it is the Directors of Volunteers in Agencies. And so that is a statewide organization, and they might even be a national organization as well, but here in Colorado, and then there's different chapters in different areas. So those can all be some additional resources that you could reach out to. So we appreciate everyone sharing with us today. We want to give you one more opportunity to do that. So is there any last questions that anyone might have on anything we covered or maybe didn't have time to cover? We have just a few more minutes together. We'll give you a couple seconds to be able to type that into the chat box here. So any other questions or something else you'd like us to share on? We'll give you just a minute to be able to do that. I know sometimes it takes if you've been busy doing something else while you listen to us. So someone asked about sharing what they missed. So again, as a reminder, this has been recorded. And so it will be emailed, a link for it will be emailed to everyone either later this week or the first of next week, along with the PowerPoint. And then again, we did send a little handout too for everyone to be able to utilize as they went through this. Pretty basic, but it gave some information for you. Do we have any other questions or concerns someone would like shared? And again, I kind of noted this a little bit earlier, but someone asked about us sharing like our interview and application information. I think Katie would probably be open to doing that. And actually, I would put that out to all of you because I think a lot of you are doing some really good work as well. So if you have, and I'll put this in the follow-up email too, but maybe if you want to send to me what your volunteer application looks like and then questions that you use for interviews, we'll be happy to, either you can send it to me and blank out your organization's information, or then I can blank it out, but then I'd be happy to share that back out as a resource for everyone because different questions and different formats will fit well with different organizations. So we certainly will be happy to do that as well and would love to hear from some of you on that. So I know for myself, I want to say thank you for spending time with us today.
And I also want to thank you all for tuning in and engaging in the conversation. Our contact information is listed there. So if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. Especially, I think her name was Kathy who wanted application interview. So if you would actually just send me an email, Kathy, I will be happy to pass that on to you and anyone else who's interested. And we appreciate your time today and have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. And also as you close, I just want to point out real quickly that a little survey will pop up. I think there's 6 questions. Honestly, it'll take you a minute or less. So if you would please take a little time to do that, share that back for us so that we have it for our data and stats that we get to report on. But also we ask you what else it is that you would like covered in these brown bags. We want to make sure that we're sharing information that you really want to hear and have. So please make sure you take just a minute to do that as well. And as Katie said, enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, and we hope to see everyone next month at our brown bag in April.